Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one notices until the moment everything changes. The ballroom of the Grand Regent Hotel shimmered under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most homes in America, lights spilling across polished marble floors and tables dressed in white linen and silver. Waiters moved quietly between New York's wealthiest guests, carrying trays of champagne that sparkled like tiny stars under the warm golden glow. It was the kind of night people in magazines called historic. Billionaires, investors, politicians, and celebrities had gathered to celebrate Richard Whitmore, the technology tycoon whose companies had reshaped entire industries and whose name appeared regularly on the Forbes list beside numbers most people could barely imagine. Cameras flashed, laughter floated through the room, and a jazz trio played softly near the stage while servers glided silently through the crowd. In the middle of the ballroom stood Richard Whitmore himself, tall, confident, perfectly tailored in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than a used pickup truck. Beside him was his wife Emily, her elegant navy dress gently outlining the small curve of her pregnancy that many guests had been quietly congratulating her about all evening. From across the room, it looked like the picture of success, power, and wealth wrapped neatly into one moment beneath the chandeliers. Then something happened that no one expected. A sudden movement. A sharp sound that cut through the music like a glass dropping onto marble. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A violin note hung unfinished in the air. Dozens of heads slowly turned toward the center of the room where Richard and Emily stood. Emily's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, her expression stunned, her breath catching as the room fell into a heavy silence that felt almost unreal. No one spoke. Not the politicians. Not the investors. Not the security guards positioned along the walls. The richest and most powerful people in Manhattan suddenly looked like statues carved from marble. Some stared into their glasses. Others glanced away as if the chandeliers above had suddenly become fascinating. The silence grew thicker with every passing second. At the far edge of the ballroom, a young black waitress named Naomi Carter stood holding a silver tray of champagne flutes, the stemware trembling almost imperceptibly against the polished metal as she watched what had just happened. Naomi had worked dozens of events like this one since moving to New York 3 years earlier, 12-hour shifts on her feet, moving quietly between people who rarely noticed her existence. She knew the rules of rooms like this. Servers stayed invisible. Servers kept moving. Servers never interrupted the guests. But tonight Naomi had seen something no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Emily Whitmore's hand was still pressed against her stomach, her breathing shallow, the fabric of her dress shifting slightly as she steadied herself. Around them, the most powerful people in the city remained silent, trapped between wealth, influence, and fear of crossing the wrong man. Naomi felt the tray grow heavier in her hands. The music had stopped completely now. You could hear the faint hum of the ballroom lights above and the quiet clink of ice settling in untouched glasses. Richard Whitmore slowly adjusted the cuff of his jacket as if nothing unusual had happened, his expression calm, confident, the same expression that had intimidated competitors and reporters for years. For a moment, it looked like the entire night might continue as if nothing had happened at all. But Naomi Carter was still standing there watching, and something inside her was beginning to move that the rules of rooms like this were never designed to stop. Naomi Carter had learned very early in life that some rooms expected her to be invisible. The silver tray resting against her palms felt heavier now, the cold metal pressing into her fingers as she stood near the edge of the Grand Regent ballroom, while the silence continued to stretch across the marble floor like a shadow that no one wanted to acknowledge. 3 years earlier, Naomi had arrived in New York City with a single suitcase, 2 pairs of shoes, and a folded letter from her mother tucked carefully inside her purse. The letter had said only one thing that mattered. Work hard, keep your dignity, and never let the world convince you that you are smaller than your heart. Naomi repeated those words to herself on subway rides before sunrise when she traveled from her small apartment in Queens to jobs that most people in rooms like this would never notice. During the day, she sometimes worked at a neighborhood diner where truck drivers ordered pancakes by the stack and tipped in loose quarters. At night, she worked events like this one, black. Uniform pressed neatly, hair pulled back, moving quietly between tables filled with people whose watches alone could have paid her mother's medical bills back in Detroit. The tray trembled slightly again as Naomi watched Emily Whitmore standing beneath the chandelier light, one hand still resting protectively against her stomach. Something about the way Emily was breathing caught Naomi's attention immediately. It was shallow and uneven, like someone trying very hard to remain composed while the ground beneath them shifted. Naomi had seen that look before. She had seen it in hospital waiting rooms and crowded bus stations, and once in the mirror when she was 19 years old and unsure how she would pay for her next semester of community college. Around the ballroom, the wealthy guests slowly began moving again, but not toward Emily. Instead, they returned to quiet conversations that sounded forced and careful, voices lowered to polite murmurs that pretended nothing uncomfortable had just happened. One man lifted his champagne glass and laughed too loudly at something that was clearly not funny. Another couple studied a painting on the wall, as if it had suddenly become fascinating. The security guards near the doors remained perfectly still, trained to protect important guests, but not to question them. Naomi understood the rule instantly, because she had seen it many times before. In rooms filled with power, silence often arrived faster than courage. Across the floor, Richard Whitmore adjusted the sleeve of his tailored jacket and glanced briefly around the ballroom with the calm composure of someone who had spent his entire life believing that every room belonged to him. Magazine covers had called him a visionary. Financial networks had called him unstoppable. People like Naomi had simply learned his name because the companies he owned appeared everywhere, from smartphones to office buildings rising across the Manhattan skyline. Standing only 20 feet away from him now, Naomi realized something strange about the moment unfolding in front of her. For all the wealth surrounding him, Richard Whitmore was completely certain that no one in this room would challenge him. Naomi could feel the weight of that certainty hanging in the air like the chandeliers above them. She glanced once more at Emily, whose breathing still had not settled, and Naomi remembered the small ultrasound photo her sister had once shown her years ago, a blurry black and white image that somehow contained an entire future. The tray in Naomi's hands lowered slowly as a quiet decision began forming in her chest, a decision that the rules of rooms like this were never designed to allow. Richard Whitmore had built a reputation in America that most people only read about in business magazines. Reporters often described him as the man who could walk into any room in Manhattan and bend the atmosphere to his will. His companies stretched from Silicon Valley to the financial towers of Wall Street, and the digital platforms he owned reached millions of people every day before they even finished their morning coffee. The skyline outside the ballroom windows carried several buildings that investors jokingly called the Whitmore Corridor because his money had helped raise the steel beams that touched the clouds. People in the room knew this history well. That was why the silence around him felt so heavy. Power had a way of filling empty space. Earlier that evening, the host of the gala had introduced Richard Whitmore with a voice full of admiration, explaining how the billionaire had donated millions of dollars to universities and technology programs across the country. Applause had filled the ballroom then, glasses lifted, cameras flashing as if they were capturing a hero. Richard had smiled in the confident way that people develop when success follows them for decades. For him, rooms like this were familiar territory. He had spoken on stages larger than this ballroom and negotiated deals worth more money than most Americans would earn in 10 lifetimes. To Richard Whitmore, the people surrounding him tonight were not strangers, but part of a network of influence that moved markets and shaped headlines. Senators stood near the bar discussing policy. Venture capitalists compared stock projections beside the dessert table. A television personality laughed brightly while holding a microphone near the stage. Everyone here understood the unspoken rule that followed powerful people everywhere they went. You did not confront them in public. You did not challenge them in front of their peers. You waited, you smiled, and you protected your place in the room. That rule was now hanging silently over the marble floor like an invisible ceiling. Richard stood tall beneath the chandelier light, his posture relaxed, his expression steady, as if the brief disruption earlier had already disappeared from his memory. His eyes moved across the guests with calm assurance, and several people quickly looked away when his gaze passed over them. The message was clear without a single word being spoken. Richard Whitmore expected the evening to continue. Emily Whitmore stood beside him, still quiet, her hand resting gently against the curve of her stomach. The soft lighting reflected off the polished floor beneath her heels, while a faint breeze from the air conditioning vents stirred the edge of the linen tablecloths nearby. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed suspended between two possibilities. One path would allow the night to return to its polished rhythm of speeches and champagne toasts. The other path required someone to interrupt the order that wealth had carefully constructed. Near the far wall, Naomi Carter watched the scene unfold with steady eyes. From where she stood, she could see the entire room clearly. The powerful guests, the silent security guards, and the man at the center of it all who appeared completely certain that no one present would dare step outside the rules that had protected him his entire life. Naomi understood something in that moment that the rest of the room had chosen to ignore. Power only remained unchallenged when everyone agreed to remain quiet. Naomi Carter lowered the silver tray slowly until it rested against the edge of a nearby service table, the faint clink of crystal glasses touching each other sounding louder than it should have in the quiet ballroom. The air felt different now, thick with the kind of tension that made every small movement noticeable. Across the polished marble floor, Emily Whitmore remained standing beside her husband, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach as she tried to steady her breathing. Naomi watched carefully, the same way she had learned to observe customers during long shifts at the diner in Queens, noticing details other people ignored. Emily's shoulders were tense. Her breathing was shallow, and something about the stillness around her did not feel right. Naomi knew the rule of events like this one. Servers were supposed to move silently along the edges of the room like shadows, refilling glasses, clearing plates, disappearing whenever the wealthy guests turned their heads. They were not supposed to interrupt conversations, and they certainly were not supposed to step into the center of the ballroom, where the most powerful people in the city stood talking about investments and politics. The supervisor had reminded them of that rule before the event began. Keep the service smooth. Do not draw attention. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Pour champagne. Smile politely. Go home after midnight with tired feet and a modest paycheck. Naomi glanced around the room again. The guests had started speaking quietly now, their conversations careful and restrained as if everyone was pretending the moment earlier had never happened. A man near the stage laughed softly at something his colleague said, but the sound faded quickly when he noticed the uneasy atmosphere still hanging over the crowd. Several people avoided looking toward Richard and Emily altogether. It was easier that way. Naomi understood why. Richard Whitmore carried the kind of influence that could open doors or quietly close them forever. People built careers by staying on the right side of men like him. Challenging that kind of power required more courage than most people were willing to risk during a formal gala filled with cameras and reporters. Naomi felt the cool air from the ceiling vents brush lightly against her face as she stepped away from the service table. Her shoes moved across the marble floor with a soft sound that seemed to echo farther than it should have. One step, then another. She could feel several people beginning to notice her movement even before they turned their heads. A server walking toward the center of the ballroom was unusual enough to attract attention. Naomi kept her eyes forward. Emily Whitmore shifted slightly, and for a brief moment their eyes met across the distance between them. Naomi saw something there that made her decision final. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was fear mixed with exhaustion, the kind that appeared when someone felt completely alone in a room full of people. Naomi had seen that look before in hospital waiting rooms, where families waited for news that felt bigger than money or reputation. Her steps continued forward. Behind her, one of the security guards near the wall straightened slightly, noticing the unexpected movement from a member of the service staff. Conversations around the ballroom began to quiet again as more guests realized that the young black waitress who had been standing near the wall only seconds earlier was now walking directly toward the center of the room, where Richard Whitmore stood beneath the chandelier light, still surrounded by people who had not dared to challenge him. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her now, but she did not stop walking because in that moment she understood something simple that the entire room had forgotten. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that decides whether silence continues or finally breaks. The soft sound of Naomi Carter's shoes crossing the marble floor carried farther than she expected, each step echoing faintly beneath the tall chandeliers as conversations around the ballroom slowly faded again. Guests who had only moments earlier been whispering to one another now turned their attention toward the unexpected movement. A waitress was not supposed to walk toward the center of the room. Everyone in the service industry knew that rule. The center belonged to the guests, especially guests like Richard Whitmore. Naomi felt the weight of those unspoken rules pressing down on her shoulders as she moved forward, yet she did not slow her pace. 20 feet away, Emily Whitmore still stood with one hand resting over the gentle curve of her stomach, her posture tense as she tried to steady herself. The bright ballroom lights reflected softly against the polished floor, creating small reflections around the heels of Naomi's shoes as she approached. Richard Whitmore noticed her movement now. His eyes shifted toward her with the calm curiosity of a man who was used to being approached only when people had permission. For a brief moment his expression carried mild confusion, as though he was trying to understand why a member of the service staff had stepped beyond the invisible line that separated workers from the wealthy guests. Naomi stopped several feet away, close enough now to see the faint strain on Emily's face. The music had not resumed. The jazz musicians near the stage sat quietly with their instruments resting in their laps, watching the scene unfold along with everyone else in the room. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes fixed on her uniform, her hands, her face. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a manager from the catering company had begun walking quickly in her direction, clearly realizing that something outside the carefully planned schedule was happening. One of the security guards near the wall took a cautious step forward as well, ready to intervene if necessary. Naomi felt the cool air of the room filling her lungs as she drew a steady breath. She remembered the letter from her mother again, the simple words written in careful handwriting that had guided her through many difficult days. Work hard. Keep your dignity. Do not shrink when something is wrong. Naomi looked at Emily Whitmore once more, noticing that the woman's breathing still had not settled. Emily shifted her weight slightly, as though trying to remain composed under the watchful eyes surrounding her. Richard Whitmore stood tall beside her, his posture confident, his gaze now fixed on Naomi with a calm but unmistakable authority. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent space between them. The tone was not loud, but it carried the quiet command of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He asked if there was a problem with the service. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how the moment would end. Naomi understood that every second she remained standing there placed her job at risk. Servers were replaceable. Billionaires were not. Yet something deeper than fear held her feet firmly in place. She was close enough now to see the tension in Emily's expression and the way her hand had not moved from her stomach. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, gathering the courage that the entire ballroom seemed to have misplaced, knowing that whatever she said next would break the silence that had protected everyone else in the room. For a moment, no one in the ballroom moved. Naomi Carter could feel the quiet pressing in from every direction, thick and heavy beneath the crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across the marble floor. Richard Whitmore stood only a few feet away now, tall and composed, his eyes resting on her with the calm patience of someone who expected the interruption to end quickly. Behind Naomi, she could hear the soft but hurried footsteps of the catering manager approaching, likely preparing to apologize and guide the waitress back toward the edges of the room where servers were meant to remain invisible. Yet Naomi did not move. Her attention remained on Emily Whitmore. Up close the signs were clearer. Emily's breathing was uneven, each inhale careful and shallow as though she was trying to control discomfort without drawing attention to it. Her hand had not left her stomach, fingers pressing lightly against the fabric of her navy dress. The bright chandelier light reflected faintly in her eyes, and Naomi noticed something else that the rest of the room seemed unwilling to see. Emily was struggling to remain steady. Naomi had spent enough time around hospitals and family waiting rooms to recognize when someone's body was under stress. Years earlier, she had sat beside her mother in a Detroit clinic where nurses spoke in quiet, reassuring voices while machines hummed softly in the background. You learn to notice small details in places like that. The way someone breathes, the way they shift their weight, the way their hands instinctively protect something important. Naomi drew a slow breath, the cool air filling her lungs as dozens of powerful people waited to see what a waitress would possibly say to a billionaire. The jazz musicians near the stage remained silent with their instruments resting in their laps. The catering manager slowed his pace as he realized Naomi had already reached the center of the room. Even the security guard who had taken a step earlier now paused, watching carefully. Naomi lifted her eyes to Richard Whitmore for a brief moment before speaking. Her voice was calm and steady, not loud but clear enough to carry through the stillness of the ballroom. She said that she was sorry to interrupt the evening. Then she turned her attention gently toward Emily. Naomi explained that Emily did not look well, and that she might need to sit down for a moment and breathe. The words were simple, almost quiet, yet they carried through the silence like a small stone dropped into still water. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. A man near the bar lowered his glass slowly. Richard Whitmore's expression tightened just slightly, the calm confidence on his face now touched with something new. Surprise. For the first time that evening, someone had spoken directly about what the room had been trying so carefully to ignore. Naomi did not raise her voice or accuse anyone. She simply stood there, a young black waitress in a pressed uniform, pointing out the obvious truth that power had been trying to bury under polite silence. Emily Whitmore's shoulders lowered slightly as though the words had released some of the pressure she had been holding inside. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Richard Whitmore to respond, because everyone understood that what happened next would decide whether the silence returned, or whether something far more difficult had just begun. The silence after Naomi Carter spoke felt heavier than before, as if the entire ballroom had suddenly realized that the moment could no longer be ignored. Emily Whitmore's shoulders lowered slightly, and she drew a slow breath, the kind someone takes when another person finally acknowledges what they have been quietly enduring. For the first time since the tension had filled the room, a few guests began to look directly at her instead of pretending to study their drinks or the paintings on the walls. Richard Whitmore remained still beneath the chandelier light, his expression carefully composed, yet the certainty that had surrounded him earlier had shifted. Naomi noticed it in the subtle tightening of his jaw and the brief glance he cast toward the surrounding crowd. Powerful men were accustomed to controlling a room, but control often depended on the willingness of everyone else to remain silent. Naomi had gently broken that silence, and now the atmosphere was changing. From the far side of the ballroom, a voice suddenly spoke up. It belonged to an older man who had been standing near the bar beside a group of guests who recognized him immediately. His name was Dr. Michael Langford, a respected physician from New York Presbyterian Hospital who had attended the gala as a donor for the medical foundation being celebrated that evening. Dr. Langford stepped forward with calm urgency, adjusting his glasses as he approached Emily. His voice carried a quiet authority shaped by decades of experience in emergency rooms where hesitation could cost lives. He asked Emily if she was feeling dizzy or short of breath. The simple question caused a ripple of concern through the crowd because it shifted the focus of the evening from social status to something far more serious. Emily hesitated for a moment before nodding slightly. Her hand remained over her stomach as she admitted that she had been feeling lightheaded for several minutes. Dr. Langford immediately turned toward the nearest table and gestured for a chair to be brought over. Several guests who had been standing nearby moved quickly now, eager to assist in a situation that suddenly felt less like a social disruption and more like a medical concern. Naomi stepped slightly aside as the chair was placed behind Emily. The pregnant woman sat carefully, taking another slow breath while the doctor knelt beside her to check her pulse. Conversations throughout the ballroom had completely stopped. Richard Whitmore stood only a few feet away watching the scene unfold, his posture still upright, but noticeably quieter than before. Naomi noticed that he had not spoken again. The certainty that had once filled the room around him had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Attention was no longer centered on his reputation or his wealth. It had shifted to the well-being of the woman sitting beside him and the unborn child she carried. Dr. Langford looked up after a brief moment and spoke with steady reassurance, explaining that Emily likely needed fresh air and a short medical evaluation to ensure that both she and the baby were safe. The words spread through the room like a sudden realization. If Naomi had not stepped forward, no one might have noticed how much Emily was struggling to remain steady. Several guests exchanged quiet looks of recognition, understanding that the smallest voice in the ballroom had changed the direction of the entire evening. Naomi remained standing quietly nearby, her hands resting calmly at her sides, while the powerful room around her slowly began to understand that a moment of courage from someone they had barely noticed might have protected two lives. Dr. Michael Langford remained beside Emily Whitmore, while the ballroom slowly transformed from a celebration of wealth into a quiet circle of concern. The chair beneath Emily had been positioned carefully near one of the round tables, and the bright chandelier light above reflected softly against the polished marble floor as several guests stepped closer, their earlier hesitation replaced by genuine attention. Emily drew a deeper breath now, her shoulders slowly relaxing as the doctor spoke to her in a calm and reassuring tone. He asked her a few gentle questions about how she was feeling and reminded her that pregnancy sometimes made the body more sensitive to stress and crowded environments. A glass of water appeared in someone's hand and was passed forward until it reached Emily. She accepted it with a grateful nod, her fingers steadying around the glass as she took a small sip. The atmosphere of the room had changed completely. Only minutes earlier the crowd had been focused on business conversations and investment rumors. Now their attention rested quietly on the seated woman and the life she carried. Richard Whitmore stood a short distance away, his posture still tall, but noticeably quieter than before. The confident energy that usually surrounded him seemed less certain now as he watched Dr. Langford continue checking Emily's pulse. Naomi Carter remained nearby, standing just far enough away to give space, while still able to see that Emily's breathing was beginning to stabilize. The catering manager who had rushed forward earlier had stopped several steps behind Naomi, clearly unsure whether to intervene or simply allow the moment to unfold. Around the ballroom, guests began speaking again, but their voices were softer now, carrying the careful tone people use when something important has just been revealed. A woman near the stage whispered to her husband that someone should open the side doors to allow fresh air into the room. Within seconds, a member of the hotel staff moved to do exactly that, and a cool evening breeze drifted gently inside from the Manhattan skyline outside. Dr. Langford finally stood and addressed Richard in a steady professional voice, explaining that Emily should step outside for fresh air and perhaps visit a hospital for a quick evaluation simply to be cautious. His words were not alarming, but they were firm enough to make the suggestion clear. Several guests nodded quietly in agreement. Richard Whitmore looked toward Emily then, and for the first time that evening the powerful businessman seemed less like the commanding figure who had dominated headlines, and more like a husband confronted with the reality that something more important than reputation had entered the room. Emily met his eyes for a moment before glancing gently toward Naomi. The young waitress had not spoken again since her simple observation had changed the direction of the evening, yet her presence remained part of the moment that everyone now understood. Emily's expression softened with quiet appreciation, the kind that does not require words. The security guards moved subtly to clear a path toward the side entrance while a few guests stepped aside to create space. As Emily slowly rose from the chair with careful assistance from the doctor, the entire ballroom watched in respectful silence. In that quiet movement toward the open doors, many of the wealthiest people in the city realized that the most important action of the night had not come from a speech or a donation, but from a young woman in a server's uniform who had simply refused to ignore what everyone else had pretended not to see. The cool night air from the open doors drifted slowly through the Grand Regent ballroom as Emily Whitmore stepped carefully toward the exit beside Dr. Michael Langford. The quiet crowd parted naturally, leaving a clear path across the polished marble floor, while the bright chandeliers above reflected softly in the glass windows that overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan. Emily moved slowly but steadily now, her breathing calmer than before, one hand still resting gently over her stomach while the doctor stayed close beside her in case she needed support. The tension that had filled the room earlier had begun to dissolve into something quieter and more thoughtful. Guests who only minutes earlier had avoided looking in her direction now watched with sincere concern. Some nodded politely as she passed, offering small gestures of encouragement that required no words. The side doors opened fully, and the cool evening breeze carried the distant hum of New York traffic far below the tall hotel windows. Richard Whitmore walked a few steps behind them, his expression far more subdued than the confident image that had greeted guests earlier in the evening. For the first time that night, he seemed less interested in the attention of the crowd and more focused on the woman walking toward the fresh air beyond the ballroom. Near the center of the room, Naomi Carter remained standing quietly, her hands resting calmly at her sides. She watched as Emily paused briefly near the doorway before stepping outside. In that moment, Emily turned her head slightly and looked back toward Naomi. Their eyes met across the distance between them, and Emily gave a small, grateful nod that carried more meaning than a speech ever could. Naomi returned the gesture with a gentle smile before lowering her eyes again. The doors closed slowly after Emily and the doctor stepped out onto the terrace, leaving the ballroom wrapped once more in soft golden light. Conversations did not immediately return. Instead, many of the guests remained still, reflecting on what had just happened. Some looked toward Naomi with quiet respect, realizing that the evening might have taken a very different turn if she had chosen to remain silent like everyone else. A few moments later, the catering manager approached Naomi, his expression uncertain but no longer irritated. He simply nodded once and gestured toward the service table as if to say that the night could continue. Naomi walked back across the marble floor, the soft sound of her shoes echoing gently beneath the chandeliers. She lifted the silver tray again and straightened the line of champagne glasses, their crystal edges catching the light like tiny stars. The jazz trio near the stage slowly resumed playing, their music drifting softly through the room once more. Outside the tall windows, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the dark river, while traffic moved steadily along the distant streets. Inside the ballroom, the celebration would continue, speeches would be given, and business deals would likely be discussed again. Yet something subtle had changed in the room. People had witnessed a moment when courage did not come from wealth or status, but from a young woman in a simple uniform who had refused to ignore what mattered. Naomi Carter lifted the tray and stepped quietly back into the flow of the evening, her presence once again almost invisible to the casual eye. Yet the memory of what she had done lingered gently in the minds of everyone who had watched the silence break.